Okay, good day and welcome back to the channel. I'm about to dig into those tappets to get after that oil leak. Now, you should be able to see, hopefully, this pipe right here is what feeds oil up into the tappets. And I have a leak right here on this carrier that goes between the two jugs. So, we need to get that pulled off so we can get it remedied. I'm going to film a little bit of this because I obviously wasn't doing YouTube when I rebuilt the engine. So, give you just a little idea of what the inside looks like. The good news is, because we have oil pumping up through here, that means we have a good oil pump. So that's a plus. So, stick with me. We're going to dig into this. Very gently pull this gasket out. The crappy thing is I got paint on or primer on it, so that kind of helps seal it down. But it should come out and be okay. It'll be very gentle. Very gentle. So you can kind of see what my issue is. I'll bring it closer. We've got a head bolt here, and 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 here. That all have to come off so that this carrier can come off. And you can see right there is where that tube comes up. It goes into this tube which feeds the carrier with oil, and that's where my leak is, right around that ring. So that's what we have to get to. So I got the fill tube off, and if I hold this just right, I think you'll be able to see it's harder than it looks. The gap between that hole and the pipe, and there is a recess in there, but I don't have any type of seal, and according to the parts manual there should be a seal. It doesn't specify if it's rubber, it doesn't specify what it is. I'm wondering, before I go and take the tappets off and then have to reset all of that, if I can find a rubber seal that I can press over that this nut, when it locks down, will put enough down pressure on to actually seal that up. So we are going to try that first. After about 5 minutes of looking, I found this rubber ring that fits perfectly around that tube. It is thick and it's tapered, and it tapers down. I was able to put the taper end down to that hole, and it's tall enough that I'm pretty sure I can cinch that nut down on top of it and actually put pressure down into that hole, center that tube, and I think this is going to stop the leak. And you know, sometimes 5 minutes is all it takes. It's not right, but I think it's going to do what I need it to do. So we're going to give that a shot before I spend a good evening just taking the tappets apart and taking this head up, and then another good evening just putting it all back on and redoing the specs and things that I'd rather not deal with if I can make this work. So I'm going to go ahead and put it back together. Actually drove that ring pretty hard. Good contact. I think that might actually do it. Fingers crossed. Okay, we're back to trying to start the 335 today. First thing I did was turned it over just to see if that oil leak was fixed. It is. As you can see, I've actually been cranking it over quite a bit, and it's nice and dry now. So that quick fix that I was able to do with that rubber ring seems like it did the trick, and I'm very happy about that I don't have to take the tappets off again. So that's that. The next thing I moved on to was, when we last talked about it, I thought it was one of two things. Either my timing isn't right, or the carburetor isn't right. So I started with the timing, and I tried to turn the distributor 180. Found out that you can't do that on these. The pin and the slot are offset, so this will only go together one way, which for hacks like me, that's actually pretty handy. So after I fought with that for a while and realized that it's not, I can't flip it around, it's got to be the way that it is, I put it back in and attempted getting it started again. So then, as I was turning it over, much like on the last video, I started to think, I don't understand why when I choke it and then let the choke valve open, I get fire, but not for very long. So then I started to choke it, and then along with my finger, I would assist the little air valve at the bottom. You can't see it because it's closed, or it's open. So that little valve right there that you can see, I started pushing that pin in with my finger. Then I would actually, with it choked, I would get success with it idling for a little bit. Which again didn't make sense to me, because when that choke valve is closed, when the butterfly valve is closed, the engine should be creating enough vacuum to pull that little pin open itself and create that airflow. So for whatever reason, I just felt like I wasn't getting suction from the engine. And so I would start it, and it would run a little bit, and it was enough for me to actually start playing with the timing on the distributor by turning the cap, that I was able to stop the backfire and get a really decent spark. And then I actually ran it long enough that I was getting a little bit of heat built up, which obviously isn't a good thing. However, I was starting to get residual smoke coming out of the end of the carburetor, a little bit out of the top of the tappets, but most importantly, I was seeing little white clouds of smoke right here, and it didn't make any sense to me. Now, if you remember back to one of the first videos that I did on this thing, the original manifold was completely busted off right here and all welded back together, and so I decided I was going to buy the whole manifold intake set. And so I did that. I swapped it out, and honestly, I didn't even think to really look it over all that much. So I saw that white smoke, and as I bent down to look, I realized, for whatever reason, there's a port there and there's a port there, and they were wide open. And so that explains why I wasn't getting suction from the engine, because I was losing it all right there. So I found some bungs, I put the bungs in, and that made a world of difference. That pretty much solved my problem. And so I gotta put the spark on. Now obviously I've got more adjusting to do on the carburetor. You don't want to let it run for too long. I don't want it to get too hot, but as you can tell, it's going to run, which is super exciting. Okay, so 2 days ago is when I shot the video of this thing running, and so now we have to make some decisions as to what to do next. Two options. Option number one is we deal with the gas tank. I haven't looked it over really well, but I did look at it a little bit yesterday. Took the cap off. The inside's got a little bit of rust. Could probably use a liner or at least a pressure wash at the bare minimum. Gonna need a new gas cap. But the other big piece is this fuel gauge sender is trashed, and I saw what I think in the bottom of the tank to be the steel rod that was hanging off the fuel sender, busted and laying there. So yeah, not quite sure what I'm going to do about that yet. I know that one of the challenges that I've got coming up is I usually get my gauge clusters from Steiner. However, Steiner no longer makes their aftermarket 445, 335 gauge clusters. So I started looking at other places, and it turns out that Steiner is the vendor for all of the other places. So if you're looking for an aftermarket 335 or 445 gauge cluster, you're SOL. They had some type of defect in them that they couldn't get fixed, and apparently it wasn't worth making them anymore, and so they discontinued, and they will not sell one that they have on the shelf. I already tried. So that means that all that work that we did to get that speedometer worm gear and get that in place and know that it was working is going to be for naught if I can't figure out a gauge cluster. Now I have a gauge cluster that I'll have to try to rebuild, but that'll be for a different endeavor. And the only reason I bring that up is because when you buy the aftermarket gauge cluster from Steiner, you get the fuel sending gauge with it. That's how I did my 445. So without having access to either one of those, I'm gonna have to figure this out. Now I still have my old fuel sender gauge from my 445 that I may be able to reuse. I just don't know. I don't know if it actually worked. I never hooked that one up. I just put the new one in and went with that. So yeah. The other thing is the radiator, and this is the one that came out of it. Now I'm not certain if this is the original, but I know that there were definitely problems with it. I know that for two reasons. One, the way that this thing looks, and two, there's a picture of it when it got picked up out of the farm field it was sitting in, with a milk can hanging off the front of it, and the top of the water pump was run into the milk can with PVC and then back out the bottom into the water pump. So there were definitely problems with a radiator. It might have been this radiator, I'm not sure. You can definitely see some type of a patch or something was attempted here. I haven't tried to float test it. I haven't tried to put water in it. I'm positive that I'm not going to like the results if I do. So I started looking for an aftermarket. Now the difference between a 335 radiator and a 445 radiator, the 445 radiator, the lower tank is actually cast into the bolster. So there's just a flange on the 445 and a gasket that bolts up to that bolster. So luckily on the 335s, the bottom tank was separate. That makes it much easier, you would think. So I started looking yesterday. Measurements are roughly 16 inches wide, 22 inches tall, and it's going to have to be pretty close to that. I'm going to go look at my 445 and take some rough measurements to see if I can sneak by with something a little wider, but I'm guessing I'm not going to get much wider. If you look at the fan shroud, these brackets are what hold the lights on the side panel. So side panel sits flush up against these brackets, and that gives me, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch extra to play with if these brackets weren't there. But without the brackets, I have to figure out how to secure the lights. So that's a whole thing. And from the little bit that I looked yesterday, it's going to be a lot tougher than I thought to find a 16-inch wide, 22 to 24 inch tall core. But we're going to keep trying. I think that for sure this is where I'm going to focus all my effort, because I really want to get a radiator on it now that it's running, so that I can run it longer, so that I can tune the carburetor, get that set. I can start looking at the 3-point lift, put hydraulic fluid in it, and actually see if we got leaks there, or what we have to work with. It's definitely the next step, is getting after this. So that should hopefully be what my future videos are about. I did want to get away from the project just for a minute and talk about the Now Then thrashing show. So I went there on Sunday. Now Then runs Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I usually only go for one day. I did bring a couple of Molines in 2018 when it was a Moline feature. I did not bring anything this year. I had other obligations throughout the weekend, so Sunday was unfortunately the only day that I could get there. The flea market was not a disappointment. It usually isn't. It's usually better than Alma Lund's. And I did find a couple, or at least one thing in the flea market. And then I got a couple other trinkets. So I got my shingle, which of course I get every year. I got my button. And then when you display something at Now Then, you get a nifty little plaque like this. This is from the 2018 show when I brought my Molines. And I have this post that I display all these little trinkets on at the shows. And the sticky back is really no good, but they had extras, so I was able to pick up 3 more so that I can wrap all the way around my post, and it was just $2 a piece. So that was kind of cool. That's going to look nice when it's done. So I got all that, and then in the flea market I found this. It's powder coated and painted. It's going to be a nice little addition to the wall in the shed. Yeah, I just thought it was cool, and that's usually what I do. I buy useless things because I think they're cool. So walked away with that, and then just one other thing to add about the Now Then show. It was at that 2018 show on Saturday of the 2018 show that I actually purchased the 335 that I'm working on now. We had been discussing purchasing it over social media, but we actually met the gentleman at the show and bought it, and then it was he brought it down to us on Sunday when he was running tractors home. And so I wasn't even thinking about it, but Saturday was when I got that thing to actually run decently. And so that means it was exactly 6 years to the day that I bought it, that I got it started, which is ridiculous if you think about it. I was really hoping to get it make it happen long before that, but things work the way they work sometimes. The last thing is I got this in the mail today, which is sweet. Means we have more parts. So in this box here, we have an alternator. And we have a couple of the starter connections so that I can stop arcing the starter every time that I go to start this thing. And I figured I'd buy a couple just because I know the one on my 445 is 9 years old and it's getting pretty rusty and worn, so it's time to replace that one too, and then I'll have one for the shelf. What do we have here? We've got governor spring assembly. I wasn't quite sure if the one on this was worn or not. I'm still not 100% sure. I'm not going to tell until we get the carburetor set and we see how the throttle function is. So just going to hang on to it in case I need it. And then these are the pivot arms for that starter button that go to the pull rod. Grabbed a couple of those. And a new knob for the throttle. And that would be my tachometer and speedometer cable. Just in case I actually get the gauge set rebuilt and we can hook it up. So that is what I picked up from Steiner. And so we'll tinker with some of that stuff until hopefully I can get a radiator in. So until I see you the next time, take your foot off the clutch. Have a good one, everybody.